I think we'll make a start. Thank you so much for coming to our book launch. My name is Tom McManus. I am the Acting Director of the International State Crime Initiative, which is a research centre here at the School of Law. And we define state crime as organisational deviance which involves human rights abuses. So you can have a look at our website, statecrime.org, if you're interested in more. We are delighted to have Antoine Bousquet here with us today to launch his second book, The Eye of War. The book will be available for purchase afterwards for £15, which is a heavy discount. I was looking online earlier. And I'm sure Antoine will sign it if you want it as well. Antoine is a reader in international relations at Birkbeck and has been there since 2007. I think we're really lucky to have him here today to discuss this book with us. Really, we wanted to hear from Antoine directly. It really fits in with our research, so we are really excited. Antoine's going to talk for about an hour, and then we will open it up to the floor for discussions, and I'm sure we'll have some fruitful discussions, questions and comments afterwards. And that's all I need to say, so thank you, Antoine.
Thank you. Okay, well, thanks for all of you for coming. Thanks to Professor Gordon for the invitation in the first place, and thanks to the Institute for having me here. And without... we should probably pause and say
Click the space bar.
there we go. So, I'm going to talk about the essential argument of the book and the general project that was behind it. And in a sense, the starting point of the book, which is a broader investigation into military perception, was to start from the perspective that we increasingly find ourselves. We increasingly find ourselves within a world that is characterized by a condition of global targeting, which is to say that any entity located anywhere on the surface of the planet is liable to being struck with deadly force. And we've seen this notion come to the fore in recent years through a lot of attention paid to targeted killings through drone strikes, but that actually is merely one of the latest technological manifestations of a growing condition. But correlated to this targeting, and key to it, is the ability to perceive entities within this increasingly global battle space. So much so that increasingly the capability that we see emerging is one in which whatever can be perceived can be destroyed, that there's an alignment between perception and destruction. So starting off from this perspective, from this statement of affairs, my investigation was an attempt to, first of all, to ask three main questions. The first question really to say, well, how we got here. Oh, sorry, rather before saying that, just to give you a sense of this, the ways in which US military even thinks about this today. If we look at the United States Air Force in 2014, they state very clearly that their nuclear and conventional precision strike forces can credibly threaten and effectively conduct global strike by holding any target on the planet at risk and, if necessary, disabling or destroying it promptly. So this idea of global strike is very much at the heart of the way in which advanced militaries are thinking today. So as I say, one of the first questions I tried to answer is to understand how we got here in the first place. Is to propose a history of the present, if you want, to say how did this capability emerge, what are its key constituents, how did it come about in the first place. A second set of questions revolve around the role and the changing configuration of the individual, of the human operator within this regime of visuality. What happens to warfighters as they become increasingly embedded in complex assemblages? Where do we locate the agency of the actor, or any agency, within these systems of global targeting? Finally, third question really is attending to what the wider consequences of this emerging capability and condition are for the landscape of war and security in the 21st century, to try and start trying to think about how war is changing as a result of this capability, as a result of a generalized vulnerability attached to visibility. So the book attempts to break down this capability, understand its constituents of what we, through a notion of a martial gaze, that is to say a long-standing attempt to precisely develop an ability to destroy what can be perceived. And I suggest in the book that there are really three key constituents, and then a fourth kind of annex one, three key constituents of the martial gaze. There is the capabilities of sensing, which is really the ways in which visual or sensorial information is acquired, and the ways in which it may be correlated with targeting processes. Processes of imaging, which have to do with the ways in which this sensorial information is represented, so that it may be distributed, stored, submitted to further analysis. And then a component of mapping, which really has to do with the way in which sensorial perception, its representations, become correlated with geospatial frameworks. Since, after all, the purpose of the martial gaze is ultimately the projection of force in a kinetic context, largely a bracket, my understanding of war in the book is largely as a kinetic form of violence. I have a bigger discussion about how broadly we want to conceive war. But anyway, for the purpose of kinetic targeting, of global targeting in that perspective, you need obviously to be able to spatially navigate the Earth. You need to be able to send munitions, weapon systems to particular points, and therefore you want to be able to correlate perception with geospatial frameworks. Finally, there is a domain of activity which isn't a core constituent of the martial gaze, but covers all the counter practices to the martial gaze. Or to what, following Paul Virilio, we might call the logistics of perception. Hiding is effectively all the ways in which actors, entities attempt to deny, to obstruct, to mislead the martial gaze. So, of course, covers practices such as camouflage and stealth and so on. It's very significant, of course, because it emerges in a kind of dialectical relationship with the martial gaze. It offers limits to it, but it also provides a spur for its further development. So when certain countermeasures to military perception are developed, very quickly we then have further developments in military perception. Again, when we're studying the question of war, we need to attend to that interaction and action and reaction, which is at the very heart of conflict. So, before I move into the first of these categories, sensing, I think it's important to start the inquiry, and this is what I do in the book, start the inquiry with a particular moment in history which at first view might not have a lot to do with war, but in many ways lays much of the conceptual, theoretical foundations of the logistics of perception. I'm thinking specifically here about the invention or the discovery of linear perspective in the early Renaissance in the Italian Quattrocento. So when we think about linear perspective, of course, we associate that with the great masterpiece of the Renaissance period. The specificity of linear perspective in artistic representation is that ability to portray space in an optically very similar manner. So, for instance, typically when we look at a painting that's been painted according to the rules of linear perspective, and they are very much geometric and optical rules, then of course we have the sensation that we are observing or that we are witnessing a real physical space that is simply a natural extension of our real space. That's certainly the intention of the artists. And in order to do so, of course, it relies on a certain set of understandings about the nature of optics, about geometry, and we find that at this particular moment of linear perspective, actually it's a convergence of a variety of fields that are developing at the same time. The field of optics, the field of surveying, the ability to measure distances by eye, to record them in maps. All of it is really an ability to translate subjective optical experience with objective physical space. So the key importance of the linear perspective here is that it corresponds to a combined process of a rationalization of vision and a mathematization of space. And this key process is one that unfolds in the centuries that follow, even if the techniques of perception will eventually migrate beyond the strictly optical realm to the much wider electromagnetic spectrum. Nonetheless, the fundamental principles of rationalization of perception and mathematization of space remain. A final important point to make about this moment of linear perspective. The conventional account of linear perspective, I'm not the first to draw attention to that moment in cultural history. A lot has been written about linear perspective in both artistic and wider history. One of the accounts we hear most commonly, and it has indeed, there's a core truth to that, is that the linear perspective is in a way can be associated to the advent of the modern sovereign subject, because the specificity of this artistic expression is that it presents to us the world as it appears to us, to humans, and their optical systems. That is a clear break with all previous artistic precedent, where artists made very little attempt to represent things as they appear to us through our senses, but rather to represent much more numinous symbolic scenes. In the Middle Ages, you want to paint a religious painting, you paint Jesus as larger than anyone else, not because that's how he would look in our physical space, or how the disposition of the scene would appear to us, but merely because symbolically he's the most important character. So people have associated this to have argued that what we see in a perspective is a deeply humanist perspective, where where the world now revolves around human perception and is no longer the world inhabited by a numinous spiritual otherworldly presence. As I say, I think that there's an important truth to that. But simultaneously, something quite different is also happening in linear perspective. Because while at one level it enthrones a sovereign subject, simultaneously it objectifies perception. Right? It makes perception subject to a set of mathematical rules that can be repeated, taught, and ultimately automatable. So perception is no longer a purely embodied phenomenological experience, but something that can be externalized, reproduced, and soon dispossessed from the human. So the perspectival subject is both a subject and an object, and that will have important ramifications as perception becomes increasingly something that gains in sophistication and detachment from human embodiment. Okay, let's turn to sensing. And the way I approach sensing and try to make sense of it is through what I've called 4 orders of targeting. 4 distinct successive principles, systems by which perception has been aligned with targeting. And these come in successive historical periods, and through them there's an ever deeper embedding of perception with targeting that also gains in precision and range. But crucially, it is also it is not simply a succession of regimes that displaces the other, but rather that embed themselves. Each previous regime embeds itself in the successive one. So, starting with the first order of targeting, which we could simply refer to as aiming. It's a fairly straightforward and simple one. It's really the alignment of the line of sight with the line of fire. This could in some ways be drawn back all the way to the earliest projection weapons, but it's very clearly instantiated in the rifle, where you align your sight with the gun sight, and the weapon system is designed to more or less send the projectile alongside, along the same axis as the line of vision. This, of course, becomes supplemented subsequently through telescopic vision, the ability to extend the natural range of human vision, and therefore to perform the act of targeting at great distance. Telescopic vision is, in a sense, also a very important moment in this story, because, of course, it's the first prosthetic extension of human vision. And the first telescope is unveiled in 1609 in the court of Maurice of Nassau. Maurice of Nassau was the preeminent military leader of the time, was credited with reintroducing some of the classical techniques of training and military discipline. And when it was presented to him by a local glassmaker, it dawned very quickly on individuals that this had profound military implications. Indeed, one of the guests at Nassau's court was Ambrogio Spinola, who was the commander of the Spanish forces in the Low Country. And he observed, rather prophetically, that from now on, I can no longer be safe, for you will see me from afar. Nassau reassured him that he would instruct his men not to fire at him. But I think Spinola saw quite far that what this would ultimately lead to, what the extension of perception would lead to, would be an increased vulnerability, and that distance would increasingly no longer be protection. Now, if we move on to the second order, we're dealing with what I call ranging. And the problem of ranging it arises when you start alongside the development of modern artillery, so in the early 16th, 15th, 16th centuries. With artillery, typically you're dealing with parabolic trajectories, so you're no longer simply able to line of fire with line of sight, because either the distances are too removed that you simply can't shoot in a straight line, you need to use a parabolic trajectory, or there might be obstacles, or whatever it might be. Ranging is a means of measuring distance visually, by visual means. And the great advantage of this for the process of targeting is that if you can gain an idea, an assessment, a measure of the distance of a target, then you will already be able to optimize your artillery fire to a large extent. So ranging really came about through the use of surveying techniques of ranging. All of this really is part of the rediscovery of ancient mathematics that happens in the early Renaissance, transmitted through the Islamic world. And the principle of ranging is actually a fairly straightforward one, at least to us, which is it's the application of fairly basic trigonometry. You will probably recall at school you were taught that if you know the measurements of one side of a triangle and you know two of the angles of that triangle, then by applying trigonometric formulas, you can obtain the length of the other sides and the angles and the remaining angle. So in order to therefore range, all you need to do here is take the measurement of the base of the triangle, you know this distance, and then optically you determine the angles of that imaginary triangle. And there you go, you know the length of one of those, or both of those lengths of the triangle, and hence you have estimated the distance to the target. Much later, we see systems for automating this task, which is kind of emblematic of a general process that we see, where the abstraction is mechanized and is instantiated into physical, technical artifacts. This is a optical rangefinder from the First World War. Basically just a tube with some clever system of glass and prisms and lenses, whereby a single individual can look through the rangefinder, receive us images from both sides of the triangle of this tube, which represents effectively the base of the surveying triangle. The operator aligns the images that appear in their eyes, and once they've aligned them, they can simply read off the rangefinder the distance to the target. These are fairly small rangefinders. Some of them have bases of several meters and can range at miles. These were very important technologies in naval warfare in the early 20th century, and as well just for artillery targeting and in general in the First World War. But ranging, as powerful as it is, has its limits. And its limits, in particular, is when you start having to target mobile entities. Because, of course, if that entity is sufficient distance or moving fast enough, you might be able to range it at a particular moment in a precise way. But by the time you've sent the projectile over, that target has moved. In other words, the problem is no longer targeting merely in space, but targeting in space-time. This is a problem that first emerges in naval warfare around the turn of the 20th century because of the distances involved in the ships and the large artillery, large cannons that they're able to use. And the ways in which you solve this problem is through what I've called the third order of targeting, which is tracking. Tracking is effectively the pursuit of successive ranging measurements. So if you range continuously, or at least punctually over a certain period of time, you will have a plot of points, and then mathematically you can make a prediction about where the future positions will be. And on that basis, you target the predicted position of the enemy target at some point in the future. As I say, the problem began to be addressed in naval warfare, and was in fact solved to quite a large extent with early, what we might call early computational analog computational technology. But it took on a new urgency in the interwar years, and then even more so in the Second World War, with what became known as the anti-aircraft problem. The problem being that aircraft, of course, move very fast, and therefore the techniques that were employed in the naval context were simply not fast enough to perform the tracking calculations in time. So, in order to do so, you developed, well, in fact, this was one of the drivers of early electronic or electrical computation technologies, and the creation of sophisticated systems of feedback whereby various entities are communicating with each other through electrical means to a computer that is performing the calculations and feeding back those instructions to anti-aircraft positions in order to shoot down aircraft. This gives rise to, therefore, increasingly sophisticated assemblages. This is a director tower on a Royal Navy battleship in the Second World War that is operated by no fewer than 4 individuals. If you can't quite see the fourth one, he's right here, embedded in the device's very large base rangefinder. But as successful as tracking was to a degree, and in a sense, technically, mathematically, the problem was solved pretty much in the Second World War, it was nonetheless found to not be the ultimate solution. The problem simply was there was too much statistical uncertainty involved in predicting the future, and this statistical uncertainty only worsened as aircraft gained in speed. You had the introduction of jet engines just after the Second World War. So it's quite clear that you would not be able to solve the anti-aircraft problem purely through tracking. And hence, the fourth order of targeting, the order of guiding. And guiding really relies on effectively moving the targeting process within the munition itself, so that the munition can continually adjust its position, continually make predictions about the future position of the target until the very moment of its impact with the target. This is Project Pigeon. This is something that was worked on by B.F. Skinner during the Second World War. B.F. Skinner was the most prominent psychologist of the 20th century, became very famous after the war as one of the founders of behaviorism, involved many experiments with the conditioning of pigeons. Well, in the Second World War he was already at it, already conditioning pigeons, but what his wartime project was a guidance system, and he came up with a pigeon-guided missile. The principle of the system really is to condition the pigeons to peck at a moving target. These were to be intended to be battleships. This was to be an anti-naval missile. And the pecks of the pigeon at a screen would send instructions into the guidance system of the missile, correcting any deviation from the target. On the top right, we have here some of the footage taken by Skinner. These are projections, a video projection, or film projection rather, of a battleship, and this pigeon is being trained, rather effectively it seems, at pecking at that screen. This is a 3-pigeon guided missile. Skinner determined that actually it would be preferable if you had 3 pigeons, so they could democratically decide what the outcome of the decision should be, and it would cancel out the possible erratic performance of any of any pigeon. Unless there's a very particular conception of democracy, of course. Project Pigeon never really came into full operation, partly to a large extent because Skinner had trouble convincing military officials that it wasn't, in his own words, a crackpot idea. But as a matter of fact, I think Skinner fairly credibly argues that the basic technical foundation of it was sound. In fact, it seems to have been sound enough that after the war, the US Navy continued to fund very much the same project, which only came to an end when the advent of radar and infrared guidance technologies made it quite clear that organic control, as it was called, wouldn't be an optimal principle. Note at the time that the US thinking on this was, well, this is really just a more humane version of kamikaze pilots. Right? We Americans can't ask US pilots to fly into aircraft, but we can maybe get pigeons to do so. The point being that this is obviously a kind of an aspect of marginalia really in the history of the weapon systems, but in many ways it captures the same operative principles of guidance that you would find in more contemporary systems. So take one for instance, from a pigeon to a penguin. This is a penguin missile, a Norwegian penguin missile, an anti-naval missile. Nothing specifically remarkable about it, except of course that it's emblematic of what guided missiles have become. This is an infrared missile. Point being, you could use any system of perception. The principle of guidance still remains the same. Key point here to make again is the ways in which the succession of these regimes, from aiming to ranging to tracking and to guiding, does not mean a supplanting of the latest or the previous orders by the latest orders. All these previous existing orders are still operative, still at play in various weapon systems, and in fact you can see how each order in fact acquires the previous one. In order to range, you need to aim. In order to track, you need to continuously range. In order to guide, you need to extend the tracking system into the weapon system. Of course, a very important development subsequent to, well, in the mid to second half of the 20th century is that what we typically understand as the visible spectrum, the optical domain, what we can see with our human eyes, becomes rapidly expanded into a much wider perceptual field of the electromagnetic spectrum, in which potentially any frequency can be mobilized for the purposes of targeting. Now, some have come to be used more than others in the military context, chiefly radar, radio waves, and infrared, although ultraviolet has some applications. But in principle, any of these could potentially be used. Another domain, of course, is that of sound, which is in the electromagnetic spectrum. It's movements of air. But again, the same principles apply. The same orders of targeting just can be reappropriated with differing perceptual regimes. Final word on sensing, and to note that I think what is a very significant development in the second half of the 20th century, which is the development of laser, which is stimulated emission of photons into concentrated beams of light. Now, lasers can, like other perceptual technologies, be adopted by all orders of targeting. Think about laser lights applied to rifles. You can use it for range finding. In fact, pretty much all range finding, surveying is now done by laser. It's not done by optical means. Guidance systems, laser is of course a very important aspect of guided missile technology today. But in addition to all of this, laser has a specificity, because laser is potentially a directed weapon. And this quest for laser weaponry really dates all the way back to the first laser systems in the early 1960s. To date, efforts to develop laser systems have been to some degree frustrated. We've got very good laser blinders. These have been banned since the late 1990s. But energy weapons that would be able to destroy missiles and so on are something that militaries have continued to try and develop. This here is an anti-missile laser system that the US spent billions on before cancelling it. And although, as I say, we haven't really seen laser systems operational to a large extent in the present, I think we're very likely to see some arrive within the next few decades. And all the more so because what laser seems to represent here is the final completion of this story, where light itself is weaponized, where the line of sight is completely coterminous with the line of destruction, the axis of annihilation. Moving on to imaging, when we talk about imaging, I mean, quite clearly the starting point perhaps for this, the modern history of imaging, has to do with the advent of photography in the 1830s, and what's been sometimes known as the camera eye. A point to make here about the history of photography is, to a large extent, we can see the advent of photography as the culmination of centuries of efforts to automate the production of linear perspective. So from very early on, the principles of linear perspective were assisted by various drawing aids, because the mathematics are actually quite complicated. Artists don't really want to learn how to construct these images laboriously, and a whole raft of technologies were developed in order to try and help automate that task. The camera obscura, the camera lucida are some of the most famous examples of this. And in this sense, what photography represents is that ability to produce linear perspective images automatically, by combining the lens effects of the camera obscura with the photochemical process that captures light onto surfaces. Now, in the context of the military that interests us here, photography remains pretty marginal until the First World War, to a large extent because the equipment is quite bulky, the length of exposition remain considerable, and the development of the negatives is laborious. However, as we enter into the 20th century, the technology matures, and it combines powerfully with a new technology, that of air travel or flight. And in the context of the First World War, aerial photography becomes central. It's particularly suited to the nature of the First World War, which is a war of, certainly in the Western Front, a static war of trenches, where opposing sides are fighting over fairly limited stretches of land, even if these extend across the Western continent. And it's a war of artillery, where there's a lot of remote targeting going on. And the aircraft becomes, and the aerial photography becomes, the privileged use for obtaining information, intelligence on the enemy, positions, plans, intentions, movements, and so on. And so considerable efforts are put in by both by the Allies, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Both sides of the war expend huge efforts in producing a flow of photographic images that are used to update maps, to continuously gain up-to-date information on the nature of the conflict. This extends in many ways further in the Second World War. In the Second World War, we have a much wider range of operations, of course, so much wider swathes of the world have to be brought under the photographic gaze. But furthermore, in the context of the strategy of strategic bombing, again, in close kinship between flight and photography, strategic bombing was a strategy deployed, particularly by the Allies in the second half of the war, targeted against Germany and Japan, which was premised on the notion that you would bring the enemy to its knees by dismantling their industry, by disrupting the logistics. In order to do this, however, you needed to gain a synoptic understanding of their war economy. And the way in which you would do this is to a large extent, was through aerial photography. Take pictures of their installations, their transport infrastructure, and so on. Analysts would pore over these, work out the role of these positions within the general economy, send aircraft in order to bomb it, send further photographic excursions to check what had been bombed, what the situation of this installation was, how much was being repaired, and so on. So it became a central, photography and photographic images were central to the conduct of strategic bombing. This process only extends, of course, further in the context of the Cold War, with the specificity, of course, that the photographic gaze becomes orbital. Rockets are sent up into space, early space satellites provide intelligence on enemy capabilities. And this plays a central role in the system of deterrence of the Cold War. Remember that the whole principle of deterrence is effectively nuclear deterrence, is that you need to persuade your adversary that even if they were to attack you first with nuclear weapons, you would be able to retaliate with such strength that you would annihilate them, that it wouldn't be rational for them to do so. But in order to, if you do successfully do so, ultimately the hope is to attain a balance of terror, so-called, or mutually assured destruction. The idea that both sides will be deterred from waging war because they hold each other in check. But in order for that balance to be stable, you have to have a clear understanding of the enemy's capabilities, notably how many missiles they have, what their defensive systems are. Because according to the principles of nuclear deterrence, if there's an unbalance, if one side suddenly works out that actually if they preemptively attack, they might be able to survive their returning onslaught, then it would be rational from a strategic nuclear perspective to attack. And prior to satellite reconnaissance, there was wild speculation, particularly in the United States that we know of, about the Soviet capabilities. In the 1950s, there was fear about a missile gap, about a bomber gap. Soon-to-be President Kennedy campaigned very strongly on this idea that there was a huge missile gap and that he was going to fill it. After Kennedy's arrival, with the first Corona satellite missions, the US quickly discovered that actually the Soviets were far behind the capabilities of the United States, and that put to an end fears of a gap, probably saved the US billions in terms of investments in nuclear weapons. Of course, the Soviets developed their own reconnaissance systems. The point being here that satellite observation by both sides was a stabilizing factor within the system of deterrence, that information allowing both sides to gauge one another and to make commensurate investments and strategic choices. Now, something else happens that's very significant in the second half of the 20th century, which is the progressive digitization of the image. And what the digitization of the image represents is a fundamental shift in what we might call the material ontology of the image. Recall that the traditional photography was a photochemical process. It relied on the development of certain chemicals that would register intensities of light and fix them. In the digital image, we are looking at a statistical capture of photonic values, which means that ultimately the digital images exist first as a statistical array before it appears as an image. And therefore, there are an infinity of possible visualizations of that data. This digital image has significant ramifications. Changing the material ontology is not merely an abstraction or technical detail, it has very concrete consequences. One is, of course, that you could produce images much faster, distribute them. For satellite imagery, which was one of the drivers of this digitization of imaging, is a massive advantage, because previously you sent up satellites, they shot the canisters of film, you collected them, and then you've just got a hunk of metal in space. Once you're able to communicate these images by radio communication, you can leave satellites up for years. But there are even more significant and revolutionary impacts of digitalization. The first is that because the digital image is ultimately data, ultimately a set of statistical measurements, it becomes much more easily treatable by algorithmic processing. You can effectively develop much more easily means by which machines can start to interpret, perhaps even understand the content of images. In other words, it's on that basis that you start seeing the emergence of vision machines. And so we've seen vision machines. We live in a world of vision machines that perhaps are still quite crude compared to what they may one day be. But already we have machines, including military machines, that are taught, that are able to extract from images certain objects and potentially take decisions on the basis of those distinctions and differentiations. This ties in, of course, to the abundant discussion about lethal autonomous weapon systems that we've heard quite a lot of in recent years. But the development of vision machines is only one side of the digitization of imaging. Because the flip side of that is that if an image is merely an aggregate of statistical information, it also means that you can create any vision, any image that you want, so long as you input the right values. And so, the other aspect of digitalization of imaging is the production of synthetic images. And of course, the whole development of computer graphics is tied into this. But this, of course, becomes particularly powerful when synthetic visuals become referenced with either corporeal movements or geo-referenced. For instance, this is a synthetic vision display. It's actually now a fairly commonplace technology in aircrafts. What this system does is it presents to the pilot a vision outside from the cockpit of the lay of the land as it is. But notably, as it would be if it's not obstructed by, say, clouds or meteorological conditions, or it's able to do this because these databases of these visions are created, or visuals are created by geographic databases that are being geo-referenced in real time through GPS or other geolocation technologies. And effectively, what they allow is for the operator to explore an environment, operate within an environment through this visual environment. You can, of course, supplement these visual representations by contextual information that will assist in the cognitive tasks of the military operator. So it's not unsurprising, increasingly we are seeing military operatives being immersed within synthetic visual environments. This is what, this correlates with everything we hear about virtual reality, augmented reality, all those technologies are here at play. Okay, moving on to mapping. Well, the story of mapping, for our purposes, starts with the advent of the development of what's being known as scientific mapping. Again, very much tied into the same sciences, mathematics, as we already discussed in the context of linear perspective. The ability to produce, to represent spatial extenses within, or three-dimensional spatial extensions within two-dimensional surfaces. This has powerful applications in terms of navigation and the control of space. Very clearly, the development of scientific mapping correlates with the colonial expansion of Western states. Note, for instance, that the Mercator map, the most famous kind of projection of the planet, well, the familiar shape of the continents that we know is largely a Mercator map, or variants on it. This is a Molyneux map that uses a Mercator projection. But recall that the Mercator projection principle, or the idea behind the Mercator map, is because any projection is arbitrary. Any projection of a three-dimensional space into a two-dimensional space involves sacrificing something. You can't represent that accurately. You have to make certain choices. The choice that Mercator made is that he wanted to be able to trace straight lines of bearing, of navigational bearing, as straight lines on a map. So the Mercator map was a navigational map. It was performing a cognitive task for navigators, and in that sense was participating in the exploration and the colonization of space. Now, maps, of course, have had strategic value for a long time. They've served militaries to acquire some understanding of the environments in which they are moving into. But actually, until really the late 19th century, they serve quite limited tactical uses. That's to say, maps are used generally for navigation, but then once you're setting up for battle, or once you're in battle, maps are not really of any use. Indeed, even then, a lot of maps that were being produced were off the cuff, on the ground surveys, and nothing systematic. This again changes in the First World War. We'll be noticing a pattern here about the importance of the First World War. In the First World War, again, the nature of the conflict plays a significant role because it's a war of artillery. Increasingly, you want to be able to locate entities within space, and therefore you want maps that are much more accurate than what has been previously available. And we see a huge surveying effort being conducted in this period. It's estimated that the German army produced an entirely new map of the Western Front every 2 weeks. So huge expenditure in terms of through the air and on the ground updating cartographic representations, and also furthermore adding a system of gridding. Now, of course, earlier maps have something akin to grids on it, but here this is a much more accurate and sophisticated and granular system of gridding. Why grids? Well, simply because you can use grids in order to identify locations that then can be fed into the targeting process. This tied into what became known as map shooting. In other words, someone might be able to survey an enemy position on the field, register them as a set of coordinates, send the coordinates to a artillery position elsewhere, and that artillery position would be able to work out how to target that position on the basis of that coordinate reading. Again, stories amplified in the Second World War, but larger swathes of the world are submitted to rigorous scientific mapping. All of which really culminates in some ways in the universal transverse Mercator grid that's produced at just after the Second World War. This is really a means to produce a grid system that will cover the entire planet. So now we're really now in a world of planetary conflict, where potentially anywhere can be brought into the ambit of modern scientific war. And the system of gridding really allows you to designate any position on the globe down to single square meters. So very vast areas can be given coordinates, but you can also operate at the square meter level. This system of this universal transverse Mercator grid underpins what's called the military grid reference system, which is the system used by NATO and other Western military forces, and also what powers, or at least provides a coordinate system for your GPS system. So your phones are operating on a variant of the military grid reference system. Now, of course, it's not enough to just layer a grid on the Earth. That would be too simple. In order for that grid to be effective, you need to also have an appreciation of the exact shape of the Earth. And the Earth is not a smooth globe. It's fat at the it has a bulge at the equator, and it has variations in gravitational pulls and so on. So actually, the production of a full geodesic measurement of the Earth was a huge geographic task undertaken largely by the US through military secret funding in the second half of the 20th century. That history is actually, a lot of it's quite obscure, we don't know a whole lot about it. But the outcome of it is that we have geodesic measurements of huge precision on the basis of which these grids can operate, and of course on the basis of which GPS systems function. And you'll be aware as well of how significant GPS technology is to military operations today. It allows the navigation of forces in terrain, but of course many other weapon systems use GPS as a system for increasing precision. There are future satellite navigation technologies that will further increase the precision of these systems. But all of these, of course, rely on the geodesic frameworks, on the grid systems in order to operate in the first place. In a similar way to the history of imaging, something very significant happens in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, which is the digitization of cartography and the emergence of what's known now as the Geographic Information System. In a nutshell, the key development here is that if traditional cartography was a static or at least punctuated process whereby someone goes out and surveys the field, then you come back, you produce a map, and then effectively you use that map for navigational purposes or whatever purposes you may have, the geographic system is really a system of geographic visualization or cartographic visualization that rests on continuously fluid databases. So databases that contain geospatial information, any kind of information that you want, that can be continuously updated through regular inputs of data. These then produce visualizations that are also fluid and flexible, that the user will have a huge impact in determining. It will involve lots of different layers of information that will not be all displayed at the same time, of course. They will be displayed in accordance with the needs of the user. These could be imagery, land cover, topography, zoning, parcels. Again, just look at your Google Maps and you're already operating a geographic information system where you can layer different points of data and so on. To a large extent, what the geographic information system means is that the boundary between the cartographer, the cart maker, and the cart user tends to collapse into a road, because the map user is also a map user is also a map maker to a large extent. In the military context, if we want to see the ways in which geographic information systems, which again is a technology that has deep military roots, but in the contemporary military context, we can look, for instance, at the Command Post of the Future, a program that's been running in the US military since the late 1990s, which is really an attempt to introduce or to utilize geographic information systems for the purpose of command and control. Examples of it have been deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we see there is operators, again, using maps or geographic information systems as cognitive tools, as channels of communication for the synchronization of command, where effectively, what we also are seeing increasingly, and this applies in this context and more broadly as well, is that the geographic information systems do not only rely on producing visual representations of space in optimal manners, but increasingly rely on also understanding human cognitive processes, where we're looking at the interface between two information sources, the operator and the system, which are being optimized, or attempt to be optimized, in the process of navigating the contemporary operational space of war. Which all brings us to the last activity of hiding. And of course, it's very obvious that the more the means of military perception develop, the greater the vulnerability attached to perceptibility, to visibility, the greater the efforts deployed to counter this. Again, going back to our First World War landmark, a significant thing happens around the turn of the 20th century. Actually, some of it occurs already with the introduction of khaki in the early 1900s. But what we see is a very important shift in the sartorial guise of armies. In the past, armies tended to use very bright colors, very ostentatious uniforms, no chance of missing these soldiers. There's a variety of reasons for that, some of them due to morale and using psychological warfare, others to do with the fact that in very noisy, smoky battlefields, actually what you want is to know where soldiers are, your own soldiers, because the problems of coordination and command are considerable. But of course, when you move to an era where, with the advance of rifling, you can kill individuals quite effectively at considerable distances, several hundred meters, then increasingly uniforms completely change. They become earth-colored. They try to blend in with the background, increasing the order of the days to make yourself less visible to your adversary. And the early attempts are fairly crude in the sense that monochrome uniforms, ever since the First World War, increasing efforts dedicated to producing ever more complex patterns, disruptive forms that break up the shape of the body, again developed in conjunction with an understanding of the human optical system. Gestalt theory and other theories of perception are recruited to understand how human perception works in order that you might be able to fool it. Note that in parallel with the development of camouflage, we've got its obverse, which is the strategy of decoy. Decoy is, whereas camouflage attempts to conceal a signature or conceal the visible traces of an entity, decoys attempt to simulate that signature, to present something that looks like a target but isn't really a target, in order to draw the martial gaze to something that it doesn't really want, in order perhaps to draw fire, which will then reveal enemy positions, various kind of schemes in which that enters. But decoying becomes an important part of the strategy of concealment. If the gaze, the logistics of perception are turned at a decoy, then they're more likely not to be seeing the camouflaged entities. As perception extends beyond the visual realm into the electromagnetic spectrum, so the means of concealment also have to adapt into what becomes known as stealth. Radar is a technology that, when it's introduced, seems to make traditional camouflage completely irrelevant. You can't conceal now vehicles and so on because radar will pick them up very effectively. So stealth technologies are the attempt to reduce the signature, the electromagnetic signature of weapon systems. Here's an F-117 model in an anechoic chamber. It's a chamber that's designed to measure the radar signature of their aircraft, part of the scientific process designed to reduce as much as possible that signature. Same applies with infrared. If infrared is able to detect heat signatures, then or certain frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum, then countermeasures evolve. It's just particular paints or dyes, and so on. Now, while we have this, if you want, arms race between seekers and hiders, it seems quite clear that the advantage, in technical terms anyway, seems to be on the side of the seekers. Because the trend has been quite clear that the technical means for countering perception are increasingly onerous. So if you think, for instance, about the most advanced stealth aircraft in the world, the B-2 bomber, this is a bomber that costs, if you take into account the research and development and operational costs over a lifetime and so on, about $2 billion a piece. So consequently, the US has only built about 20 of them, and there's no sign that the next generation stealth bomber will be any cheaper. This is a lot of money, even for a dominant military such as the US. So there are limits, it seems, to how much technology can counter, on its own, can counter the development of the logistics of perception. But therefore, that's perhaps why we see also, alongside these technical means, a raft of much more general strategies of concealment, dispersion, and expendability. The first of these is actually a fairly traditional one, where the enemy decides to shift the terrain of battle to areas in which the logistics of perception are less able to prevail. So, for instance, you might, typical terrains for this would be the mountains, forests, swamp areas, anywhere that's obstructed, and notably the underground. This is a schematic representation of a Viet Cong tunnel complex. The Viet Cong were experts at underground warfare, in fact so much so that they were able to maintain complexes of tunnels under a US Army base for several years without the US even realizing that it was there. So there's always the availability, the possibility of shifting the terrain to areas where modern perception is countered, where the weapon systems are also less likely to be employed. In our 21st century, it seems increasingly likely that the terrain for this is going to be ever more so the city. The urban environment is increasingly, of course, most of the world is urbanized today, and is also an environment where there's a clutter of concealment, where it's harder for advanced militaries to operate. Conversely, of course, if you decide to line up in a desert, well, you don't really stand much of a chance, as the Iraqi army discovered in 1991, and you'll note that very few adversaries of the US have attempted this anymore. They're much more likely to go down this route. The second strategy is what we might call a generalized strategy of dispersion. This is actually a set of ideas, we'll find this embodied in a set of ideas that have gained increasing currency within the US military from the 1990s onwards, articulated around the idea of swarming. Swarming is the idea that in order to reduce vulnerability, what you want to do is disperse forces on the battlefield, coordinate them through modern means of telecommunication, and at chosen times pulse, move in concert against an enemy position, destroy it, and then redisperse. There's examples of swarming that reach far back into history, but the US military has been interested in applying this in the contemporary context for some time, and it's gained a new lease of life with the development of robotic technologies In this report from the then incoming Undersecretary of Defense, Robert Walk, we have a vision of billions, I say billions, of micro drones that would be used as swarms that would crowd out the enemy. Obviously, if you imagine if you're operating billions or even just millions of drones, it doesn't matter how effective your perceptual technologies are, you're simply not going to be able to take all of them down. But swarming is not merely a strategy or a tactic that can be employed by the most technically advanced states. In many ways, we could see today that non-state actors already employ tactics of swarming. Chief examples of this would be the kind of urban guerrilla operations undertaken in Mumbai or in Paris in recent times, where small groups of dispersed individuals using mobile phones or radio communications and light weaponry scatter themselves around urban areas and are able to create considerable havoc while local enforcement forces struggle to counter them. Note as well that the logic of expendability, lots of cheap drones, who cares if you lose thousands of these? That's the point, you're just depleting the enemy's resources in that way. The logic of expendability also finds itself embodied in the suicide bomb, which is again an expendable unit and uses concealment in order to strike. And indeed, this points us to the most radical and fundamental of countermeasures, that of, well, following the philosopher Reza Nagrestani, we might call hypercamouflage. Hypercamouflage is the strategy by which the enemy entirely blends themselves into the adversary's civil society, concealing their presence within it until the very moment of their assault. And this appears, I think, should appear to us as really a logical correlate of the development of global targeting. To say that total dissimulation is the response to global targeting, and points to us to some of the unwitting dangers of global targeting. Global targeting, on the one hand, might appear to deliver to states that possess these technologies an unsurmountable advantage. But in doing so, they are inviting and they are driving the increasing concealment of the adversary outside of the conventional battle space. Indeed, the combination of global targeting and total dissimulation are together participating in what we call a disappearance of the battlefield. The conventional idea of the battlefield was a discrete space and time in which combat took place. Wars begin, wars have ends, battlefields are, in a conventional understanding, a field, a terrain within which killing takes place, and by virtue of that, a delineation of where the space of war and the temporality of war takes place. Everything else beyond it is the sphere of peace or civil society, or what it might be. But as targeting becomes globalized, and it takes as object targets that could be anywhere in the world, and as adversaries increasingly adopt techniques of hypercamouflage, we become increasingly unable to identify battlefields, battle spaces, spaces of wars as contiguous spaces, as discrete periods and times. Instead, we have a molecular form of war which resurfaces, erupts potentially at any spot, anywhere, for a moment before reappearing elsewhere. We are, in a sense, therefore moving into a world of pervasive lethality, where potentially weapon systems can be deployed anywhere. And one of the things to bear in mind is that once we've lost the ability to distinguish between spatialities and temporalities of war, we have very little frameworks for regulation and legal enforcement that have been adopted in order to place bounds on the forms that violence can take. So there is, I think, a significant sting in the tail of the development of ever more accurate and far-reaching logistics of perception and targeting. Finally, if we return to the question of the human. Well, I think one of the things that arises here is that it appears to us increasingly difficult within the complex socio-technical ascendances that are appearing to identify a single locus for agency. And in this sense, I think the debate that's going on at the moment about lethal autonomous weapon systems, in a sense, gets things wrong. Not that we shouldn't be necessarily concerned about the advent of killer robots or whatever way we want to call them, but I think that debate generally, first of all, overestimates or underestimates rather the obstacles to that. I think the technology is actually far from being mature, and in fact military institutions are not on the whole very keen on fully autonomous weapon systems. But more to the point, I think that before we get to that point, we are going to face, and I would argue we are already facing, a more fundamental problem, which is that the human agency is already being dissolved within these weapon systems, and that raises a whole raft of issues about political agency, about legal accountability, and so on. And so in many ways I think we haven't yet even taken the full measure of the extent of the problem, which is that we are appearing in a world of increasing global lethality, where the status of the human agent, that binomial of subject and object that I noted at the dawn of the modern period, is one that's becoming increasingly imperiled. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments or anything from members of the audience? I know there are. Just a question who goes first. Go.
Thanks, Antoine. I thought that was amazing. It was really good. I've known Antoine for a long time, and he's been working on the book for a very long time, so it's quite nice to see it coming together.
There is an end to
yes.
long book projects.
Yes, the things that started mine at the same time as his. So the eye of nihilism, the eye of war, there's a Freudian slip. The eye of war is the eye of nihilism, isn't it? In the sense that, I mean, it seems that your argument really illustrated very nicely the sort of Heideggerian account of the Cartesian dimensional perception here, right? She makes right from the start, which I think what seems to be the first chapter about the Renaissance and linear thinking, whereby on the one hand you've got we humanize the space at the same time as we dehumanize it, right? I was wondering if you can talk a little bit to that.
Yes. Yes, you're right. The question of nihilism, although it's not addressed explicitly in the book, is certainly at the heart of it. As you know, I have quite a major interest in the German writer Ernst Junger, and I take Junger's work to be essentially about the question of nihilism, about working through the consequences of particularly Nietzsche's writing on nihilism, but I think what he brings to Nietzsche's diagnosis is that he combines this with his experience of modern industrial war. I think his question is, how do we find meaning in war, in life, in a world that's increasingly dominated by technique, by machines? And I think that's one of the questions that this book raises. And my, if the book attempts to, formulate a warning, is that we are at risk of, and maybe we've already passed that point, where we are dominated by our means. That's these are techniques and systems that really have their own ends, and they are not necessarily ours. And we might increasingly become mere components of those very processes. And I agree. This is also, I think, to a large extent, Heidegger's problem. And I end the book with a discussion of his ideas, which of course are in conversation with that of Junger. So, yes, I think that's one of the big existential issues lurking behind the book.
Please.
Yes, thank you very much. Really super interesting. Also, you have the best pictures. Always. So I've been going on about this issue about agency for a long time. And I'm equally concerned, and in the discussions on lethal autonomous weapon systems, that's kind of the concern I also raised. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on, so when I talk to military personnel or people who work with military hardware, there's a prevalence of instrumental theory, right? So we can use it, right? And in your talk as well, you spoke about, okay, the user can use it to do X, Y, Z. At the same time, there is a problem with how much are we embedded and how much cognition can we have to be actually, you know, to have any agency as such. And was there a shift between using lenses as a prosthetic to see further, you know, where it's like an extension that we use, and then perhaps a shift where there's an augmentation which alters perception in ways that are not really our perception through interfaces, that makes this relationship between the human and technology more complicated throughout history. And then I have another question about, what about seeing and knowing, right? So what are your thoughts about the relationship? Because you can see all you want, but in order to act on what you see, you also have to know. So the relationship between seeing and intelligence in that sense.
Yeah.
And this is where artificial intelligence kind of comes in.
Yeah. On the latter question, so it's to quite a large extent I bracketed out the question of interpretation, because I think, you know, I was dealing with large enough topic as it was, and I think so it was necessary for me in a way to deal with it a little bit in the introduction, to say the fact that we can see things in the vast space does not mean that we know what we're seeing, that we understand what we're seeing. We might be able to target things with far greater precision, and you know, for all the reports about accidents and the ways in which technology is oversold, there's no doubt there's a long-term increase in precision. But that precision doesn't mean that leads to strategic superiority, because we might be targeting completely the wrong things, or we might be targeting things that we shouldn't even be targeting, you know, that we shouldn't be involved in, we shouldn't be thinking of targeting as a solution to our problems. This question, of course, comes in when we deal with the countermeasures, where you are, you know, starting to be looking at ways to fake impressions. So, I mean, this question of knowing, I think, opens up a vast set of issues, including psychological and epistemological, which I think are essential. And by bracketing them out, I'm not trying to dismiss their importance, but I think they stand outside of the confines of this particular study. And again, I suppose to provide a more deeper defense of that to some extent, if the thesis that I'm advancing that the means overtake our ends, in some ways it might not even be the most important thing. I think one of the concerns with these systems of global targeting is that whatever is, you know, we can critique them in terms of what they target, and you know, the ways in which certain bodies are more liable to be targeted than others. My concern is that these systems need targets. We might change the ways in which they target, but we might not be able to prevent them targeting altogether. That we're so invested in having these technologies and these systems today that the ends, their very existence in some ways dictates their use. On the first question about maybe the boundary between prosthetics and augmentation, or what might constitute a shift in our relationship to technology, I think that in one way you can talk about progression. It was important for me to locate the story at the beginning with a linear perspective for two reasons. First, because I wanted to be able to go as far back as I could to show that actually some of the roots of this are old. And I do this with a number of technologies. I think it's interesting to try and find the earliest, even most kind of absurd versions of this technology, because in many ways they already laid template for what would become more effective systems subsequently. The other reason being that linear perspective meant not having to start with technology, or at least to widen what we think of as technology. It doesn't have to be a machine. It can be just a rational system. It can be a way of apprehending our reality, and to some extent that comes first. But that said, I do think we can posit something of a turning point that I think is related to the development of information as a scientific concept, but also as a technological reality. And I think in that sense, we still are grappling with the importance and the significance of the cybernetic moment. cybernetics and the science that came out of the Second World War, notably to a large extent. The founder of cybernetics was Norbert Wiener. What was Norbert Wiener's project for the Second World War? The anti-aircraft problem. And Wiener understood through the anti-aircraft problem that actually you could use the same mathematics, but also the same fundamental scientific ontology of information to describe artificial and natural systems. Effectively, they are all information systems, they are all servo mechanisms that use feedback loops to regulate their behavior and so on. And once you start to understand that, then you're able to interface these systems in a way that wasn't possible before. And I think ever since, we've just seen an increasing deeper integration of that, and other developments such as artificial intelligence are linked to that. So I think the informational paradigm is key. And that's of course part of the story about the digitalization of these various media. And I think this is perhaps the threshold at which we are increasingly unable to, is increasingly no longer meaningful for us to distinguish between human and machine, organism and technology.
Sorry, I just have a question at the back, and then
Thanks. That was very interesting. I know very little about this, so this question might be redundant. But sorry, just move it down. What you were saying about this kind of turn and the shift towards digital and digitization seems like quite a key shift in terms of what gets included and excluded from the kind of reality that we see, right? So before we're seeing, we see what is there, but it seems to be that when you show the kind of augmented kind of reality photo as well, you can specifically include and specifically exclude, and that becomes what we see, and that becomes the reality that is then being interacted with. So then when you moved on to talk about urban hiding and the increasing sort of countermeasure against this in the urban centers, I guess what I'm trying to get at is there seems to be a very frightening implication in terms of what is then included and excluded as target, and then how those targets are interacted with, and then I guess this feeds into the kind of logic of killing of humans as collateral damage. So I was wondering if you could talk to that a little bit, and I guess specifically in terms of specific exclusions via digitization.
Could you put some flesh on that? Could you give me an example of what you mean by what would be the categories of exclusion and inclusion?
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is when the information is fed into the sort of, in order to digitize, are there things that are included, and then are there things that aren't included? For example, is human included, right? Is the human movement included in that? Is it excluded from that? Again, I don't know much about this, so yeah, I don't know if this is something you covered in the book or.
In all these cases, we're talking about mediations. We're talking about representations in other media, and I think these will always involve some exclusions or inclusions. The linear perspective, which is not digital in any way, has an exclusive dimension because it's a representation of perception according to a particular understanding. I suggested that linear perspective is akin to what we see with our own eyes, but it isn't. Linear perspective is monocular. It's just one central focus point. We have two eyes, most of us, and we see with depth perspective and not only with two eyes, but also we have a roving gaze. Our eyes are moving all the time, registering information. In many ways, linear perspective is a very simplistic and rationalized, over-rationalized understanding of perception. So it's already exclusionary in certain ways. I'm not sure there's any way around exclusion in any way. I think when we mediate things, we necessarily leave certain things out and we heighten others. The question is more about what are the costs and benefits of these kinds of exclusions and these types of discriminations. Yeah, I don't know whether I could speak specifically to what the digital excludes. I think that's quite a big question, I think. Yeah, I'm not sure I could speak more to that. But I think the underlying point is, you know, I think we probably wouldn't want to do without the idea that we used to have kind of some pure, authentic perception or media or representation, and that somehow has been lost. I think it's just that we proceed with different exclusions and inclusions that we've had, and what's at stake is recognizing these and exploring potentially what other mediations we can create. And within the digital medium, there's lots of different ways, I think, in which you can represent different things and push at the boundaries of that.
This was terrific, thank you. I'm wondering about something. So in a way, you're describing one trajectory, and it relates a bit to the digitization, but how basically human agency is slowly being dissolved through these different mechanisms or the development of mechanisms of perception. And so we don't need to wait for autonomous weapons. Already there's very little that the human plays in. On the other hand, it seems to me that what we're looking at has also changed. Leave it, it will stop in 10 seconds. What we're looking at has also changed. So if in the past perception was looking at who one is, are you a soldier, should I target you, we know that who one is can no longer tell us because they're in the city, they're in urban space, and they're dressed like you.
Yeah.
So we look at what one does, right? So the new forms of perception, particularly digital perception, are looking at agency, at a certain, it could be human agency, but it could be other forms of, but it's like the pattern of life, they call it, or, you know, and it's what people do. So as it seems to me that as there's this trajectory of the loss of agency, suddenly the only thing that can tell us who's the enemy is the agency of the other.
Yeah.
Would you say that's right?
Okay. There's potentially different ways in which you could approach this question, but if you want the optimistic, there's an optimistic vision or an optimistic perhaps message to be taken in the existence of countermeasures, which is to say the development of the logistics of perception doesn't lead ineluctably to some totalizing transparency where everything can be seen and power can be exerted effortlessly. There's a counter-conduct, there's a set of practices that emerge in response to it that are able to negate it or to interfere with it. So that might be a source of, well, at least provide some comfort in terms of potentiality for resistance or agency. The less kind of, well, the downside to this perhaps is that it doesn't provide an escape either, in a sense that it provides then a new spur for the logistics of perception. So at the very best, what we have is a potentiality for indefinite struggle. And maybe that's most that we should hope for. So that's perhaps where we might perhaps still locate some potential for agency and some potential for resistance to a kind of totalizing order. In reference to patterns of life and the ways in which the nature of the target has changed. I mean, the convention about uniforms and armies fighting one another through identified signifiers that maybe you're a soldier and you're not, you're a civilian. These are intersubjective conventions that geological states have devised as a ways of regulating their means of violence. That is indeed increasingly imperiled, and I think one of the challenges is, how do we regulate the use of organized violence once we no longer have symmetric adversaries, once we have a kind of radical asymmetry between hiders and seekers, and that I think is a major challenge for us, and it probably can't be solved within the existing legal frameworks, because these are all state-bound legal frameworks, and we're standing outside of that power. But the other aspect is that the targeted individuals, well, precisely, are increasingly not understood as individuals, but as bundles of signs. And I think in some ways the targeting I'm talking about, kinetic targeting, is maybe going to appear to be increasingly crude and a small component or minority component of what war could become. Because if increasingly we are moving into a post-human age, then we won't be acting merely at the level of the human body, as taken as a totality, and blow up this body, but acting at both the supra and lower levels. And after all, counterinsurgency is the manipulation of social organisms, the attempt to guide the enemy through a manipulation of their social systems and social relations. Future weapon systems are liable to act at the subcorporeal level, where molecular war would be literally molecular war, where we're acting at the level of organs, of affects, and so on. And we are in some way already there. I mean, after all, information operations is an attempt, hybrid warfare or whatever we see at the moment, is an attempt to shape people's consciousness by manipulating certain drives and so on. We don't need to destroy their bodies, we just try to get them to act in ways that we want to. So we may also find that the post-human age of warfare is not only going to be about the dissolution of the agency in the war machine, but also what the actual object of war is. It will no longer simply be centered on the human body, but at different levels.
Thank you for that. I was wondering if by the end of the book, is it still the eye of war, or is it just the eye of the state, sort of? Is it still war that is being waged, or is it sort of business as usual, and then we're going to... And I'm thinking more here about sort of notions of the everywhere war and Derek Gregory, rather than the neoliberal war of Julian Reed. Sort of, how does that, is it a diffusion of warfare? Is it more sort of politics as usual? Is that the direction that we're moving into? And then connected to that, and connected to Kevin's question, I think, is in terms of the digitization, is so the eye of war, and it is about surveillance to a certain extent, right? So in terms of the digitization and what gets excluded and included, in your sense, how is that operation racialized? Is it targeted more at certain bodies and certain targets than at others? I don't know if that's your concern, and I don't want to ask the question.
Well, I'll try and speak to it. I mean, the first thing is, since you bring up the title, I mean, in the title there is, in a sense, a deliberate kind of wordplay, in the sense that the eye of war is both about the ocular globe and is about the eye subject. The book, in a way, is asking, who is the eye, or who's the subject of war? discussed, I think that question is now quite a difficult one to answer. And related to the issue of are we still talking about war? Well, I think that's actually one of the biggest questions that we have to ask ourselves today. And I think increasingly the answer is we don't know what war is anymore. We have former commanders of the US military saying that the categories of civilians, combatants, have no meaning, no stable meaning anymore. So even the military doesn't know anymore where the bounds of war lie. And obviously it's understandably because we live in a world today where we're supposed to be in the midst of a war on terror that's almost 20 years old now, but it's become so much of a background condition that we don't even use the terminology anymore. The White House doesn't talk about war on terror, doesn't have a word or a concept to describe what it's doing. The best concept I think we have is actually we owe it to the Obama administration when they spoke about overseas contingency operations. That was their rebranding of the war on terror. Actually, it's a very good term because it indicates the open-ended nature of that conflict. The only perhaps thing that we could take issue with is the idea that it's only going to be overseas, because precisely one of the things that are being dissolved is the category of the international and the domestic. When we're talking about, to seek into the question of surveillance, I think one of the consequences of hyper-camouflage is that I think we should expect increasingly to see the martial gaze, which conventionally is understood as an externally facing design, to turn itself on domestic societies. I think it's a question of time before we see a drone strike on US soil. I think it's absolutely conceivable. And certainly, the more enemies conceal themselves in domestic societies, the more that will drive the attempt to employ surveillance. Now that then raises the kind of issues you're getting at about where that gaze gets turned to, and undoubtedly there are the questions of racialization and particular groups that are more subject to that kind of surveillance, more subject to that kind of targeting than others. I don't dispute any of these. I guess for my purposes, these are kind of an annex question, not an insignificant one in any way, but I think not necessarily an essential one. The techniques that I've talked about are being used to target Russian soldiers, German soldiers, British soldiers. They're pretty economical. They don't discriminate. They don't care. I'm not sure the machines care that much about those racial questions in themselves. We do maybe, and we need to attend to these. These are important questions, but I'm not convinced that if tomorrow we could do away with racialization, that we would have solved the problem. I don't think we will. So these are important issues, but in some ways, as I say, annexed to what I'm concerned with in the book.
I would like to add to that last point, just that computer vision and kind of machine learning kind of inherits our biases. Seems to be an issue, but I wanted I just remember your first definition of war, that was kinetic violence. Can you expand a bit of that, as opposed to static violence? Or?
Well, actually, I would not make that my definition of war. So, but effectively, I realize that's what I'm talking about in the book. But as in the answer to the question I gave earlier on, I was myself kind of thinking about how that might be a limited understanding of how targeting will proceed and already proceeds. So we could widen that idea of targeting beyond the strictly kinetic, that's to say, physical destruction at the level of the corporeal body or a military unit, to think about other ways. And in doing so, I think that gets again to this question about what war is. And I've come to this. I think I've come to the conclusion that if we want to study war, and I think we absolutely should, actually perhaps the methodological starting point we need to take is to not to try and define war once and for all, but to actually accept that we do not know its essence, and that we might be better guided by tracing the different ways in which war entangles various aspects of our lives, in the detail, in some of the ways I've done in the book. And so, I don't think the book doesn't need a concept of war. I don't need to posit what war is in order to say this is what I'm doing. I just started by looking at those systems and just following where they go. And when I invoke kinetic violence in ways, I'm reflecting on what I did, but it wasn't a conceptual starting point. So I think war is to some extent an enigma for us, and perhaps even more so, and that's been perhaps concealed to us in some degree because for several centuries wars were quite tightly bounded by our understandings of the Westphalian state system. That's become increasingly untenable in the last few decades, which is why people proliferate different wars, new wars, post-modern wars, hybrid wars, whatever it might be. But I think the proliferation of these terminologies is an indication that we don't actually understand or know what war is, and maybe that's not a problem. Maybe we should proceed from that position of ignorance, and just focus on certain processes that are observable in what we might intuit as being wars.
Sure, so the kinetic, it wasn't in connection with speeds and politics as in Libya?
No, I wasn't drawing a straight line, but of course, Virilio is an important reference for me with the book because the logistical perception is his term, and I think he was key in producing the book War and Cinema, which is the first important connection between, I think, perception and representation and war. And speed, of course, is a dimension to it, but in the book I don't make, speed is not the kind of analytical category I use, but I think most of what the book produces is perfectly congruent with Virilio's own analysis.
Question there.
Yeah, so at the end you mentioned, I found it quite interesting, that I guess the overestimation of what perhaps the layman thinks of how far advanced autonomous weapons are, for example. I'm just wondering if you can maybe discuss sort of that gap between the realm of the possible, theoretically possible, and the operationally employable, and how that gap is sort of filled by policymakers allocating R&D spending, given sort of, I guess, the extremely long shelf lives of these projects, and I guess the role for the private sector as well.
Well, I mean, I suppose it depends on what standard we set. We can build artificial intelligence, weapon systems with artificial intelligence today. It's just that we probably wouldn't find what they do to our taste, because they would be extremely error prone. They wouldn't conform to, our expectations in terms of discrimination and performance. And arguably, for artificial intelligence machines, weapon systems to be deployed, they would have to show at least a significant improvement on human systems. I would suggest. I think it's difficult because there's a lot of hype. I'm not an artificial intelligence scientist, but it seems to me that we're still at quite a significant remove from being able to field fully autonomous systems, and furthermore, I think that the appetite for that is still quite limited. I think it's a discussion that's absolutely important to have now, because whenever these systems may come online, we want to have thought about the ethical, political consequences of them. But I think we're still at a remove. And at a remove, I think, partly because we can't answer these questions about the political and ethical and legal ramifications. It's been observed many times that if we had an autonomous weapon system and it committed a war crime, we don't know how we would legally prosecute that war crime. Who's put in the dock? Is it the drone itself? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the last human who pressed the button? We don't know, right? And for that very reason, I think that militaries will want to have humans in the loop for quite a long time, because there will be someone to take the blame. My point is, that might become a pure legal fiction. People are involved, yes, they might press the button, but if they press the button because the machine has told them that this is what they should be doing, that all the information they received has been processed through algorithms and artificial intelligences, then yes, we have humans in the system, but to a large extent, they've just become, an ephemeral component, maybe still with a role to play. And indeed, I think what's likely to happen is that with the cognitive integration, human brains are likely to be superior in many activities compared to artificial intelligence. So we're much more likely to see a closer symbiosis between them. But the legal fiction will be that somehow this is an autonomous human decision. It won't be. It will be the outcome of a disaggregated process of decision making and computation.
I had a question myself about the most recent nuclear posture review that Trump had ordered. Says they reiterated their commitment to retaliatory strikes only, but they added in that the first strike against the US doesn't necessarily need to be nuclear anymore. It could be a cyber attack. So that obviously raises all kinds of problems. And I don't know if you came across where we are with sensing, mapping, perception in a cyberspace and hiding from the other side, and how accurate you can ever be about identifying who the enemy is in that space. And another question is, have you seen in your research a turn from hiding from the traditional enemy so that you keep your resources and you're not attacked or whatever, to hiding from the regulatory framework, to hiding from regulators themselves so that you're not attacked by whoever that regulator might be, whether it's the international community or civil society?
Yeah.
You're planning something.
Well, I mean, in
That's
some ways,
probably be a charter.
I mean, in some ways, these questions are connected because if there's such a thing as hybrid warfare, and I'm a little bit skeptical of the terminology of hybrid warfare, where I suspect we're talking about quite a lot of things, practices that have been, are quite old in some ways, but nonetheless, to the extent that we can talk about concerted strategy employed by an actor such as Russia, I think that what we're seeing is precisely the attempt to use various means of coercion that may involve things that do involve some force, but fall nonetheless consistently below the threshold for response. So we've seen in Ukraine, for instance, that the problem has been for NATO is that more generally with Russian kinds of expansionism, which is what Russia's been conducting doesn't allow the NATO to kind of fall back on its various commitments to collective defense, because there's problems of identification, there's the question of, well, is this an act of war or something else? And I think we can probably credit the Russians sufficiently with pursuing that purposefully. So in that sense, it's not perhaps a concealment from regulation, but it's an attempt to disavow what we understand as the conventions of what war might be, to keep the adversary guessing and unable to respond because they cannot frame what is going on in a manner that they can respond to. And I think that the attempt to, there have been various moves in the past to say, well, the nuclear deterrent should be used to deter cyber attacks. But in practice, these are hollow words to some extent, because I think it would be very difficult for the US to just nuke another state on the basis of saying, oh, we received a cyber attack and you're just going to have to take our word for it. So these are moves within kind of to attempt to signal things, but I think the game for a lot of adversaries, the Chinese or the Russians, or the US may have its own equivalents, is increasingly precisely to operate under the threshold of what would fall under legal frameworks, but also even within the kind of strategic framing that states employ to guide their policy. So there is a form of concealment here, which takes us beyond the concealment that I'm talking about in some ways, because it becomes an extensive set of smoke and mirrors, and that we associate with intelligence, counterintelligence, various deep state kind of operations, which I think we obviously need to address in a much more systematic way today, because I think our own academic understandings of these things are quite some way behind the practice.
Thank you. Yep, another question.
Just like to congratulate you on your camouflage.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking